The cosmic data stream. Boundaries store the book. If you treat NDEs as private hallucinations, you miss the storage layer. Physics keeps pointing to edges as where information lives. Not poetic edges, physical boundaries that set what can be known and stabilized. If the review feels like a high-bandwidth summary, ask the practical question. When local write access fails, where would a system pull a summary from? From places already holding compressed, redundant records tied to you. Start with the holographic hint. In gravity, information scales with area, not volume. Black hole thermodynamics says the number of possible internal states is proportional to the horizon's surface area. That doesn't mean our universe is literally a 2D movie screen. It means boundaries encode constraints powerful enough to reconstruct bulk behavior to the precision any observer can test. If bits scale with area, nature, S telling you where the ledger sits. Translate that to daily life. You've been writing your state into nearby boundaries for years, into other minds through memory, into artifacts through text and images, into your environment through causal traces. Those records aren't in one vault, they're distributed and redundant. When your internal process loses fine-grained control, the only data that remains quickly accessible is what's already stabilized externally. That's why the review centers on consequences, correlations that propagated and were copied. Think in light cone terms. Your personal light cone is your causal instance, everything you've touched and everything that touched you. Inside it, the world saved your state in pieces, videos, notes, habits, and other people's routines, photons that left your face and landed in sensors, where patterns on tools you used. You are not a single database. You're a graph of correlations with dense clusters around relationships and work. Under crisis, the self-model relaxes and indexes that graph by redundancy, cross-checkability, and reach. Here's the shortcut nobody teaches. Panorama logic is compression logic. A panoramic perception feels like everything at once, but it's really the readout of maximally correlated summaries. Who you hurt, who you helped, who copied your choices, where your signal traveled. That readout doesn't require mystical access. It requires boundary access. Edges encode, the bulk follows. Guardrails matter. Holography is robust in theory land, but our universe isn't the clean toy model. Don't overclaim. Use it as a guide. If area bounds information, then any finite horizon, including your local apparent horizons, caps storage and forces compression. Within that cap, redundancy wins because it makes facts subjective. Now bring in the energy bill preview. Landauer's principle says erasing one bit costs heat. The universe charges for deletion. That means wholesale wiping is expensive and rare. Life writes more than it erases and spreads records across channels. Your diary might burn, but your impact persists as copies in minds and matter. Under duress, a system would query summaries that are cheap to fetch, highly redundant patterns. A life review can feel instantaneous because you're not retrieving every microstate. You're re-indexing the compressed catalog of what's stuck. Let me show you how this looks when you map it. Imagine a network diagram of your last year. Nodes are people and artifacts. Edges are interactions weighted by frequency and emotional salience. Now color edges by redundancy. How many independent channels corroborate each event? The brightest edges dominate a boundary-accessed review. The apology that rewired a relationship, the project that shipped and changed a team's habit, the failure you hid that still leaked consequences. Those edges are easy to fetch because they're everywhere. Most people trip on observer. They hear quantum observer and picture a mind forcing outcomes. Swap that for information flow. The world renders when information about alternatives spreads irreversibly into the environment. Observation is copying. In that sense, the light isn't a hallway, it's an interface, an access layer where redundant records are available in a unified channel. You cross a boundary where local coherence is gone, and you're handed the summary your instance can still address. Personal light cone again. Your instance is just the degrees of freedom you can still couple to. As internal write fades, your readable surface becomes those robust external encodings. Entities may appear because your brain needs a permissions metaphor, a guide, a gatekeeper, a presence that authorizes access to shared records. Underneath the iconography, the function is consistent: context setting, scope selection, consequence readout. A micro story to anchor it. A student's grandfather's NDE centered on one decision decades earlier, a call not made that cascaded into years of silence. The review didn't replay breakfasts. It focused on that fork because it was the highest redundancy node. Many lives branched, many later stories referenced it. When they mapped who retold the story, how often, and what choices followed, it clicked. Redundancy picked the highlight reel. 2 practical moves. First, when you hear an NDE, listen for redundancy. Which scenes have many independent witnesses or durable artifacts? Those will dominate. Second, if you want different scenes to survive your own review, start encoding them now. Speak publicly, document clearly, teach repeatably, and design behaviors others will copy because they're useful. If boundaries encode and redundancy drives access, then the sharpest context switch is obvious. Death, where decoherence spikes and the environment's records overwhelm the shrinking internal stream. That's where the observer story gets precise without mysticism. Interactions fix bases, horizons gate access, and the interface returns only what the ledger already can't forget. The observer at death, decoherence and the sharpest context switch. Death isn't a fade to black. It's a brutal context switch where the environment takes over your bookkeeping. In daily life, your brain runs a tight loop: sense, predict, act, update, keeping your self-model coherent with rapid writes. At the edge, that loop fractures. Internal coherence collapses and the world's copies of you dominate. Not because a mind collapses a wave, but because information starts flowing outward with no way to pull it back. Let me back up and say it cleanly. Decoherence happens when information about alternatives leaks into the environment. Air molecules, photons, sensors. Each interaction entangles your state with countless degrees of freedom. Interference dies locally because the phases that kept alternatives coherent are smeared into places you can't retrieve. What looks classical is just entanglement growth, making recombination practically impossible. At death, that process spikes. Blood flow stalls, metabolism plunges, ion gradients wobble, and synchronized patterns that hold a crisp self-model unwind. Meanwhile, the environment around you is saturated with your records, photos, messages, habits embedded in other people. Decoherence turns those records into the active context. Your dwindling amplitudes don't steer the show anymore. The environment does. Now here's where most people mess up. They picture a ghost hovering, choosing a timeline. That invites mysticism where physics offers mechanics. The better frame: your brain usually maintains a narrow pointer basis, a set of stable variables like body position, voice, social identity, that the environment redundantly confirms. Under stress, that basis relaxes. The accessible correlation graph widens to include what you've already broadcast. The feeling of panoramic access is your instance surfing redundancy as internal gating fails. Think about redundancy like voters. One neuron whispering can be lost. Billions of photons saying the same thing win. Quantum Darwinism says objectivity emerges when many fragments of the environment carry the same information about a system. At the edge of life, the redundancy you seeded, memories in others, traces in media, physical imprints, outvotes your private state. The observer at death is the environment measuring you from every angle. There's a timing objection. If the brain is offline, how can there be any coherent experience? 2 points. First, offline in clinical language means below detection or disorganized, not metaphysically zero. Transitions are messy. Pockets of residual activity persist. Second, content can be dominated by readouts of already stabilized correlations rather than new writes. Compression reads fast. When synthesis stalls, indexing redundancy is the shortcut. Let me show you exactly how coherence becomes context. Picture your self-model as a stack. sensations, narrative, social roles, projects, values. In normal life, constant updates glue it together. As the glue thins, top layers, the relational and consequential, are the most redundantly encoded and easiest to fetch externally. That's why reviews lean relational. Fewer durable external records exist for raw sensation than for choices that changed people and systems. Here's the game changer most people miss. The redundancy spike at death isn't only about the past, it locks futures for others. The nurse's notes, the machine's logs, the family's memory, all stabilize facts you can no longer edit. Observation is information flow that becomes practically irreversible when erasing it would cost too much energy and coordination. That's Landauer in plain clothes. Deletion is expensive. Death is cheap on write, costly on erase. And here's what makes it visceral. You've been broadcasting yourself for years without thinking about it. The way you laughed in a kitchen lives in a friend's memory. The 2:07 a.m. email lives on 3 servers. The process you pushed keeps running on Tuesdays. Photos, messages, signatures on forms, dents in a doorframe, a phrase your kid repeats. Those are your echoes, already copied, already out in the world. When your local write fades, those copies don't disappear. They're what's left. And because many independent channels agree, they feel more real than any private thought you never shared. That presence people talk about at the edge isn't a ghost. It's redundancy coming back as truth, a chorus of your own echoes, loud because so many channels align. A micro story. In hospice, a colleague sat with a parent whose last hours weren't about sensations but reconciliations. Calls made, letters written, the one apology still missing. Afterward, what everyone remembered and retold were exactly those moments. Weeks later, photo captions, texts, eulogies replayed that same set. That's Darwinism at human scale. Many channels copying the same bits until they're the only objective story left. So fix the mistake. It's not mind collapses wave. It's interactions fix bases. At the sharpest context switch, horizons gate access and interfaces return what redundancy can guarantee. The review feels instantaneous because it's a compressed, redundancy-weighted synopsis. The clarity feels moral because consequences are the most copied part of your life. The boundary feels final because the environment is still writing while you've lost your pen. What follows from that is practical. If you want different highlights later, encode them now. Speak publicly so copies multiply. Document clearly so copies stay faithful. Teach repeatably so copies self-repair. Design habits others copy because they work. You can't choose the physics, but you can choose what it makes cheap to read when it matters most. The energy ledger, Landauer's principle and immortal data. Let's pin the bill where everyone can see it. Landauer's principle. Erasing 1 bit of information costs at least kT ln2 of energy as heat. Not a metaphor, a measured lower bound. Translation you can feel. Forgetting on purpose isn't free. Any device that resets memory pays in heat. Any process that permanently clears a record leaves a thermodynamic scar. Now tie that to the edge you'll meet. Decoherence spreads information outward. Quantum Darwinism stabilizes facts by copying them into many channels. Landauer says once those copies exist, undoing them is expensive. The default of the universe isn't deletion, it's persistence as distributed correlations. In photons, in materials, in other people's memories, in logs, in standards, in habits. Death doesn't summon a cosmic shredder. It just stops your local rights. The records you already broadcast don't blink out. They linger because erasing them everywhere would cost more energy and coordination than any realistic process can muster. The thing most people miss is that persistence isn't a perfect archive. It's redundancy at different fidelities. Your voice lives in videos and voice notes. Your choices live in people's routines. Your reasoning lives in documents and code. Your presence lives in photos scattered across phones and servers. To erase you is to reverse changes in thousands of independent stores, impractical at small scales, absurd at large ones. Landauer's bill scales with ambition. The bigger the cleanup, the hotter the burn. Here's why this shows up so sharply in a life review. When write access collapses, the only records cheap to read are the high-redundancy ones already externalized. Compression meets cost. The interface serves summaries that many channels agree on because those are easy to fetch and hard to dispute. You don't replay every microstate. You stream the consensus, where your signal propagated, who copied it, which consequences stabilized. That's why the clarity feels moral. Consequences survive copying better than sensations do. Let me show you exactly how the bill bites in daily life. Try to delete the fact that you sent a particular letter. Where does that bit live? In the recipient's memory, in the folder on their laptop and its cloud backups, in mail server logs you don't control, in screenshots, prints, forwarded chains, in every downstream decision that referenced it. Each reset requires heat and effort. Each downstream reversion costs work. You can bury traces, but you can't vacuum the world. The ledger keeps a line item somewhere. Bring this back to physics with a caution. Immortal data doesn't mean infinite access or perfect preservation. Devices fail, media rot, people die, horizons fence retrieval. Unitarity says information isn't destroyed globally. It's redistributed or scrambled beyond your wedge. Landauer adds, true erasure is costly, so the practical outcome is persistence with patchy accessibility, durable where redundancy is high, fragile where it's not. Here's the shortcut nobody teaches. You can steer the ledger. Choices that maximize redundancy and error correction travel farther. Speak in public channels. Write plainly so copies remain faithful. Teach so ideas live in many minds. Design checkable processes. Redundancy isn't waste. It's how a finite universe makes truth robust. If you remember nothing else, remember this line. Meaning equals signal that survives the energy ledger. Copied, verified, hard to erase. A micro-story to make it concrete. A small lab publishes code with tests, docs, and permissive licensing. Years later, the pie is gone, the original server decommissioned, the team scattered. The package still works because mirrors, forks, courses, and downstream tools keep the bits alive. No one held a central archive job. The redundancy web did the lifting. Try to purge it and you advertise the attempt in heat and gaps. Landauer shows up as tripwires. Now fold this into the edge experience without mysticism. The bandwidth spike of a review is speed from compression. The content bias toward relationships is redundancy. The asymmetry is Landauer, fast to read consensus, slow and costly to erase it. Once many channels stabilize a story, revisions are visible and expensive. That's why people describe the review as final in tone. The copies already outvoted your private draft. Guardrails. None of this guarantees a continuing subject after death. The model says correlations persist, access and agency do necessarily. It also doesn't sanctify every memory claim. Low redundancy details can be wrong. The safe claim is tight. The universe charges for erasure, rewards redundancy, and stabilizes objective facts by copying. Your durable part is the broadcast you've already made. Practical moves you can take this week. Convert tacit know-how into artifacts with checksums, code with tests, datasets with schemas, decisions with rationale. Teach someone else until they can independently reproduce the result. Place your work in channels that outlive you, repositories, open journals, public standards. Write legibly so future decoders don't waste energy reconstructing your intent. You aren't making content. You're lowering the erasure cost and raising the copy count. One last pass to land it. Landauer is the energy price of forgetting. Death removes the spender, not the bill. The world keeps your receipts wherever you left them, in minds, media, materials. Design your receipts on purpose. Encode the parts you'd be proud to have survive heat, time, and retelling. That's the ethical angle of physics.